Welcome everyone to today's CBOX event, which is part of the seminar and talk series in Environmental Humanities here at TEMA. Under the heading Green Room since this spring, right? This is a newly minted name for the series. Before it was EH Forum or something like that, but now it's Green Room. The series runs almost weekly, and you can find the calendar for the series at the CBOX website. And I already now want to remind everyone of the event next week, because it's a double event where Emily Felton will defend or present the part of her thesis progress, and she's a PhD at CBOX and at TEMA M. And it will be followed by a lecture by visiting Professor Fiona Cameron from Western Sydney University, who will be talking about the museum collections as more than human things. So that would be a nice Tuesday as well next week. But first there is today, and for today's event we have a guest from quite far away, and I'm very happy to welcome here today and introduce to you Christina Gerhardt, visiting scholar at UC Berkeley, and an associate professor of environmental humanities, film and German studies at the University of Hawaii. Really happy to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Christina's academic work covers a number of issues and is manifested through many activities on the field of environmental humanities and literature. She is associate editor of ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, which is a quarterly journal of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. She is also the author of the Atlas of Remote Islands and Sea Level Rise, and the editor of the volume Climate Change, Hawaii and the Pacific. Besides being an academic, Christina is also engaged as an environmental journalist, covering the annual UN climate negotiations, renewable energy and related questions for a number of publications such as GRIS.org, Nation and the Washington Monthly. As an academic scholar, she has held fellowships for the Fulbright Commission, the DAAD, that is the German Academic Exchange Service in Berlin, and the NEH, and she has been a visiting scholar at Harvard, the Freie Universität in Berlin, at Columbia University in New York, and she's also taught at UC Berkeley. Her academic writing has been published in numerous journals such as Film Quarterly, Film Criticism, Mosaic, New German Critique, and in edited volumes such as My Ocean Guide and Water and Atlas. And water is also surrounding the topic of her talk today, which, as you can see, has the title Atlas of Remote Islands and Sea Level Rise. Once again, we're really happy to have you here at CBOX, and so please, Christina.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here. I've been tracking with really keen interest on the website since the announcement came for different fellowships and scholarships. The roster of people who you've brought through the doors here, and I'm just totally impressed. So I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank Lauren Lafauci for opening the door for me to be here today. And I want to thank Jesper Olsen for the invitation, and also Bjorn Perenrud for the work to make my visit possible. We met at ASLE, the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, last summer. And the mention of my project seemed to garner interest. So I'm really excited to talk about my project today. Today's talk relates to my new book project, the title of which Jesper already mentioned, Atlas of Remote Islands and Sea Level Rise. I find the parenthetical in the title to be sickeningly 90s. And I keep taking it out and putting it back in. And over the course of my talk, you will understand why it's there. And I'd love if you tell me what you think I should do with this quandary, because titles matter. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share work related to this book project. I also look forward to the Q&A today. The project is very much, this is an answer to your question, Jesper, at the beginning stages. And I think books, in my estimation, are always a barn raising, which is that I don't believe in the author, single author, cult, Goethe, whoever it is, author with a capital A. I think books are a result of this kind of discussion. And so I think it's a privilege and an honor to have this opportunity, and I really look forward to hearing from you as well. The project and my talk today draw on and bring together three fields And then as I listed them up, I realized there were 3 or 6, depending on how you count. Geography and cartography, and this is also what I'm going to talk about, like these 3 components in my talk today. Geography and cartography, environmental studies and environmental humanities, and then thirdly, literary studies and creative nonfiction. So I'm going to discuss theories, I'm going to discuss studies or approaches related to each of these 3 fields. And let me just start then right away with geography and cartography. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Artist and geographer Trevor Paglen coined the term experimental geography in an article that was entitled, you'll notice a theme here, Experimental Geography from Cultural Production to the Production of Space. And this was published in the edited volume, Experimental Geography. The concept refers to and builds on the work of Nato Thompson. He's the editor of this volume, and he wrote in his article, next slide please, in 2 directions of, quote, geography as art and art as geography. So drawing on both fields, art and geography, Trevor Paglen at once tracks what stories geographies tell us, such as his work with A.C. Thompson, which was to track planes involved in the CIA renditions program, published in a book under the title of Torture Taxi, bringing into light what otherwise might have been invisible or conjecture to the historical record. So the work that Trevor Paglen and A.C. Thompson did in Torture Taxi is they went to the desert in Nevada, southwest US. They used telelenses. I mean, they were, available to the public, but also extremely expensive, so not available to the entire public. And they brought the tails of planes that were flying in and out of this military base up really close, and then used publicly available materials to document where they were coming from and going to, and therefore proved that the CIA renditions program was actually happening, contrary to what then President Bush had argued. So this is an example of where they take things that are invisible, and it's very much a preoccupation of Trevor Paglen's work, and why he was involved with the Edward Snowden documentary. He's looking at bringing things that would otherwise be invisible from the historical record to the historical record, right, making visible. Inversely, though, Paglen also recognizes that while mapping or geography tells us one version of how the present came to be or what really constitutes it, it can also tell stories of what possible plans or futures have been foreclosed. So to that end, it can suggest alternative futures, as I said, that were foreclosed, or generate ideas for possible futures that can be activated. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. So that is, the very act of mapping could activate the speculative realm and political movement for a different future. In terms of the speculative, I'm thinking here also of work that Fred Moten has referred to as speculative practice. Let me give you some examples here. Next slide, please. Bay Area author Rebecca Solnit's trilogy of atlases, Infinite City, a San Francisco Atlas from 2010, Unfathomable City, a New Orleans Atlas from 2013, and next slide, please. Most recently, Nonstop Atlas, a New York City Atlas from 2016, does exactly this type of work, at once recovering different histories, for example, linguistic or musical, and suggesting different futures. So in the last atlas that you see here on the right, New York City Atlas, Nonstop Metropolis, for the linguistic and the and also the musical diversity, she has a map that documents the musical richness and diversity of New York City. In another one, she documents the incredible linguistic diversity of New York City. And of course, one can translate this, into different contexts in Sweden, I'm sure. They also suggest different futures. For example, next slide, please. For example, in one map that was published in Nonstop Metropolis and also as the cover of the New Yorker magazine, she relabeled all the New York City subway stops with New York City women's names. And this renaming, of course, calls attention to how men's names dominate. Women's names are less prominent in public monuments, at least in the US context. Happy to learn more about Sweden. Thereby also erasing women's contributions to history. And of course, when I talk about this example, which relates to women and their visibility or invisibility in history, or making them visible, one could also take this and extrapolate from this in terms of race, big debate in the US going on around that, in terms of class politics, etc. Go on down the list. It also suggests an opportunity to do better. So I referenced Trevor Paglen and Nato Thompson's articles in Experimental Geography because it works to connect and bridge disciplines and approaches. It also, as I mentioned, engages in this way then the speculative. My project very much stands in the lineage of these methodologies. So let me turn from the geographical framing to the environmental components of this project. And part of this was published in the call for this, in the title for this talk or abstract for it. In Let Them Drown, the 2016 London Edward W. Said lecture, reprinted in the London Review of Books, Naomi Klein called attention, as Rob Nixon in Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor had done, to the nexus of climate change, colonial racism, and poverty. But she shifted the spotlight onto oft-overlooked low-lying island states. And I have to say I was frankly really surprised when I read her article because I never expect low-lying small islands in the middle of the Pacific to come up much of anywhere. Their current situation is dire. Next slide, please. On May 6, 2016, scientists announced that 5 Solomon Islands have disappeared due to rising sea levels. Last year, 3 more islands were found to have disappeared in the region. Most recently, next slide, please. Just 2 weeks ago, on April 25, 2018, a new study commissioned by the United States Department of Military was published in the journal Science Advances. It found that, quote, more than 1,000 low-lying islands risk becoming uninhabitable by the middle of the century, or possibly sooner because of rising sea levels, upending the populations of some island nations, end quote. I'm just going to put this out there. I usually don't, but I feel like for this audience I can. Both because I'm not in the US and also because of the focus of the seed box and people I assume aligned with it. I'm bracketing a bunch of things that I'm happy to talk about more, which is that it's obviously not only sea level rise that makes these islands disappear, so the ecosystems, of islands sinking, and then sea level rise, is a more complicated thing. Another thing I'm happy to talk about a bit more is the very bizarre or interesting fact that the US Department of Military has been at the forefront of recognizing and calling attention to climate change and what one can do with that fact and observation that stands so often very much in contrast to the policy of the US government, whether it's under the current representative, I'll just say, or under the Obama administration. My new book project bridges environmental science and environmental humanities, as mentioned, cartography and geography, visual arts, literary studies, and creative nonfiction, to share the impacts of sea level rise on low-lying islands and also to show and demonstrate solutions being put forward to address them, very often by the Pacific Islanders themselves. Addressing climate change's impacts is very much a social and environmental justice project, since it tends to affect the world's poor and people of color disproportionately. Pacific Islands are some of the regions most impacted by sea level rise, but according to the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, they have been responsible for producing merely 0.03% of global CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. And there's a couple coming up. Scientists just reported last week, that is May 3rd, that for the first time since record keeping began, CO2 emissions measured at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii were reported to have risen, next slide please, above 410 parts per million for an entire month, for the first time since record keeping began. In this case, in the month of April. Next slide please. And then that's it for a bit. CO2 emissions were previously at 280 parts per million in 1880, where they are estimated to have been for 8,000 to 10,000 years, depending on how one parses it, more or less, as you can see by the variation in the slide behind me. When we hear these reports, it's key to bear in mind the inequity in both the production and the impacts of CO2 emissions. In this regard, addressing the issue of sea level rise and of climate change offers, as Naomi Klein has argued in the closing section of This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, an opportunity for the, quote, unfinished business of liberation, end quote. That is, it offers an opportunity to address centuries-old inequities of colonization, of racism, and of imperialism. The climate crisis, Klein argues, is not an issue but a frame. So what she does in her book is she argues against the perception that the climate justice movement is narrowly focused on the environment and pinpoints that it's also focused on democracy, on resource access, on resource control. If climate change necessitates a radical retooling of our economies and infrastructures, Why not retool them, she asks, in a way that deals not only with the climate threat, but also with social justice, economic justice, and racial justice? That is, why not do so in a way that ensures environmental justice? Island nations in sub-Saharan Africa have been hardest hit by the twin effects of poverty and of climate change. A 2012 World Bank report revealed that of the 20 nations with the highest annual average losses in gross domestic product resulting from climate change-related storms, so of 28 are in the Pacific. As mentioned, climate change impacts the world the most, and according to Oxfam, half of Pacific Island populations live in poverty. So as you can see, very different institutions share these views. The ones that I've mentioned here, the World Bank and Oxfam, usually not, on the same page in a conversation, as well as the United Nations and the Alliance of Small Island States, which represents low-lying and small islands at the annual UN climate talks, as do, of course, the individual nation states themselves. Islands that are predominantly in the Pacific, but also elsewhere in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, and of course it goes without saying after last fall, in the Caribbean, are already experiencing the devastating impacts of climate change, and these are, of course, only projected to increase. Prior to last year, perhaps, aside from the occasional flare-ups in international national media, and again, I'm saying this coming more from the United States perspective in terms of its media, typically in relationship to the storm season, which consists of typhoons, tropical cyclones, tropical storms, and hurricanes, or to sea level rise, little attention there has been paid to the ongoing struggles of island nations related to climate change. And the reasons for this oversight of the impact of climate change on island nations are numerous. If I could have the next slide, please. First, Pacific Islands are located, here's the remote part. Pacific Islands are located remote from continental land masses. Historian Paul Darcy has argued colonization and its territorial carving up of the Pacific, so amongst different nations that were colonizers, be it France, the UK, the US subsequently, and replacement of existing structures with new institutions often defined islands as isolated spaces, so as entities unto themselves, the word insular kind of bespeaking that, right? Yet this reading erases from view, as Tongan and Fijian anthropologist Epeli Haofa has pointed out, the very real relations among Pacific Islanders that informs both the real as well as the imaginary. These relations are evidenced, as literary scholar Teresa Shuri, who's a professor of English at UC Santa Barbara, underscores, in, quote, myths and legends, shared linguistic roots, and material histories such as exploration, migration, kinship, and tracing. So just to give a little example of that, Tahiti, people speak French because of French colonization, and yet the very, the origin of the Tahitian language is tied to the Hawaiian language. Now that means if one has the capacity to speak the Hawaiian language, where English, because of colonization, is of course the lingua franca, then Hawaiians and Tahitians could speak with one another. But that's where the language revitalization or preservation programs and culture, et cetera, becomes very key. Where am I here? Okay. Theorists such as, this is continuing the quote from Shuri, theorists such as Epeli Haofa and Albert Wendt, Shuri states, flip or undo the European tendency to isolate the land from the sea and use the word Oceania to connect all the sea, the islands, and all of their life, end quote, and histories and cultures and languages, etc. In other words, while colonization reads the islands as remote and as isolated, Pacific islands and islanders, for example, dispersed among an ocean, read it as the center, this ocean as the center, and deem themselves to be very connected. So when I first moved to Hawaii, I got a map of the Pacific because I had so much to learn. And I put it on my wall, and on the two sides were the Asian continent and then the North American continent. And that's a very Pacific Islander way of looking at that region. But Craig Santos Perez, the poet from Guam, he's talked about how usually when he emigrated from Guam with his family to the San Jose Bay Area, they asked him to explain where his island, where his home was, and he said it often wasn't on the map, even though it's a US territory, right? Or if it was at the margins. So this is the kind of thing I'm getting at here, which of course relates to mapping and colonization, yada, yada. Given colonization's hegemony in discourse that shaped historical, cultural, and geographic narratives, this framing has had lasting impacts, and I would argue, with environmental studies and humanities too. Second, relative to the world population, a very low proportion lives in the vast region of the Pacific Ocean. As Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor from 1969 to 1975, awarded the Department of Defense's Distinguished Public Service Award on May 9, 2016. I couldn't help but note that that was a couple days off from the Solomon Islands disappearing. Famously quipped about the forced relocation of residents of Bikini Atoll in the Republic of Marshall Islands to make room for the US military's nuclear testing on their home island, quote, "There's only 90,000 people out there, who gives a damn," end quote. So then population density becomes a way of creating hierarchies between regions, be they continents and islands, or on continents between urban and rural regions. So I think this becomes an issue vis-a-vis climate change and sea level rise too, when we talk about which regions get prioritized, and they're often cities, right? Thirdly, the colonialism, and fourthly, current day neocolonialism or imperialism informs these aforementioned readings of Pacific Islands as remote and isolated rather than as connected and part of an oceanic network, and as sparsely populated and therefore less important. It also manifests through disproportionate use of Pacific Islands for nuclear military tests by France, the UK, and the US. I was thinking of saying NATO allies just to underscore that they are NATO allies, knowing that Sweden isn't. I'm just to push that forward. And for military bases, as well as a disproportionate level of Pacific Islanders in the US military. And then fifthly and lastly, climate change-induced sea level rise itself needs to be considered more carefully for its root causes. Next slide, please. And I didn't have time to look this up, but I think I'm referencing people who are close by. In 2014, the Geology of Mankind, a critique of the Anthropocene narrative, Andreas Malm and Alf Hornberg, inquiring into the argument associated with the concept of the Anthropocene, take issue with the argument that humankind in general, of course the anthropos, Greek human being of the Anthropocene, caused climate change. Quote, "The fossil fuel economy," they state, "was not created nor is it upheld by humankind in general," end quote. Donna Haraway and Jason Moore, among other scholars, have sought to complicate as well the notion of the Anthropocene by suggesting the terms Thulucene and Capitalocene, and the two other works that are listed on the slide behind me. Energy usage, both historically and currently, varies radically by geography, class, race, income, among other factors, as Malm and Hornberg outline in their article. In other words, the historical responsibility for having produced, and thus for addressing climate change, rests with the so-called developed world. For this reason, many have started talking about and lobbying for reparations to repay what they deem to be the climate debt. In these ways, climate change and sea level rise cannot be read outside a history of colonialism and neocolonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. And the mentality that produced climate change continues by overlooking the current day plight of low-lying Pacific Islands. So my new book project then, Atlas of Remote Islands and Sea Level Rise, aims to present both the effects of climate change on island nations and islanders' fights to address and resolve these effects. But my book takes a different tack than previous studies, drawing on years of work as an environmental journalist, work that, as Jesper mentioned, his generous introduction, is published under the name, I should probably put this forward, Tina Gerhardt. So while I was a grad student, I was doing this work, knowing how conservative the US is in terms of whether or not it has even figured out, in terms of an administration, to recognize climate change. I put that under Tina Gerhardt and academic work under Christina Gerhardt, because I thought it would be good to have a job at the end of the day, so that Google searches, brought up one thing or the other, and at this point I'm running it together. The wonders of having a job and having tenure. And that's an issue that I'm happy to talk about, like doing two different kinds of writing, and also the politics of that decision is something I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. The venues in which I published that Jesper mentioned, aside from GRIST, which he mentioned, The Nation is so far to the left that for a lot of people in the US, at least, it's hair-raising. I think for Europe, it's not. The Washington Monthly as well, The Progressive and Climate Progress. So drawing on these years of work as an environmental journalist and on my training in research and literature, which combined led to considerations and exchanges about which narrative strategies best reach audiences, I came up for the idea of this book, I should say when environmental journalists meet covering the annual UN climate negotiations, especially coming from the US and with this kind of gridlock in terms of messaging, if you will, there is a lot of energy expended on whether or not to engage with climate deniers. I refuse to engage because I think it's like with any issue, I mean, of which we have way too many examples in the US right now. There's this kind of a fill in the blank with some ridiculous theory here, and you can either focus on that or you can focus on the actual issues and getting work done on them. So that's my position, but I thought these debates were really interesting. So the idea for the book, it's intended to be playful and serious, to make both a visually engaging and an intellectually rigorous intervention in climate change debates, focusing on oft overlooked regions of the world, remote islands. I should say too, in reviewing my talk, and this is the first time I'm presenting it in Europe, right? So I just feel like the kind of trying to get the message out there, which is such a challenge in the US, is a little bit different. We need to be playful, we can't be too serious. There's so much of this that's shaped by addressing a US audience or shaped by US politics and what it is and isn't. So I'm just going to put those disclaimers out there. Covering the UN climate negotiations like for 2 weeks, every year for a while, really made me aware of the challenge of conveying the science to a lay reader, because I was publishing in non-scientific journals. So that's one challenge, and it definitely is a challenge. The other challenge that I encountered that I was grappling with that go into this project is how to sustain a reader's interest when, and y'all have probably had various discussions about this or thought about it, I assume, how to sustain a reader's interest when so much of what you are putting forward is quote unquote so bleak. Now again, I feel like that's much more of an issue in the US. I honestly don't know, but I grew up in a really political family. My aunt was one of the co-founders of the Green Party, and that's key for my attitude because I grew up with that on this issue in Germany. When things are so bleak, I don't give up. And that's because that's just how I grew up. I feel like, I don't know if that's a US thing or different responses to politics, but those are questions that I've often got received, and they kind of inform this project. So, what went into it then is these questions of how to translate, how to sustain interest, how to lead readers to care about the issue and want to take action. And to me, it might seem cheap not being in the US context. A coffee table book seemed to be one way to smuggle in an environmental and a political message to a greater audience. Next slide, please. So my book is modeled on Judith Shalansky's best-selling and award-winning Atlas of Remote Islands, 50 Islands I Have Never Set Foot On and Never Will, published in the original German by Mare Verlag in 2009 and then by Penguin in 2010. I corresponded with Shalansky, initially thinking about working with her on the book, and she supports the book idea. We're not going to work on it together. How many of you are familiar with this book? Yeah? No? Okay, so I'll just pass it around if you're not familiar with it. I'm happy to talk about the ups and downs of that book and the kinds of revisions that my project is undertaking from it. So like her book, Atlas of Remote Islands and Sea Level Rise will feature a map of an island or an archipelago on a recto page and information about the island on the opposing or verso page. This information includes the ocean or the sea in which the island is located, its latitude and longitude for some islands and not for others in the Pacific. I might leave the latitude and longitude out. And that would be to acknowledge the traditional oceanic navigation systems, which were not based on compasses, but on observations, so not on latitude, longitude, but on observations of the stars, ocean swells, flight patterns of birds, other natural signs. The island's original or other names often bespeaking colonial legacies, its size or area, whether or not it's inhabited, if so, the names of its indigenous people's nation, its population, its distance from neighboring islands. A brief timeline highlighting the history, both indigenous and pre-contact, colonial and climate change related, 1500 to the present. And that, when the book goes around, you'll see that pretty much dovetails with what's at the top of her page, but with some tweaks to focus more specifically on environmental factors. This page will also feature, like Shalansky's book does, but again with these tweaks, a paragraph-long essay. In my case, it's going to be creative nonfiction that includes histories and stories illuminating key aspects of the island. So it's history, it's flora, it's fauna, stories about their inhabitants, their languages, their cultures. And then lastly, it's going to present the impacts of sea level rise on the island and the solutions being put forward, as mentioned often by the islanders' inhabitants themselves, to address these effects, be they political solutions negotiated at home or abroad, such as buying land elsewhere, resettling an entire population, or on the ground practical solutions such as preserving coral reefs, planting mangrove trees, or building seawalls. Some of this also involves discussions of the different kind of geological matter that different islands consist of, because that makes a really huge difference, the porosity, how porous it is in terms of sea level rise and what can be done. The maps offer a bird's eye or a vertical point of view with full awareness of the problematic historical overtones of that kind of vantage point of the island, with concentric circles around the island that highlight the sea level rise currently, and then as it's projected, the projected sea level rise for 2050 and 2100. The maps also offer a lateral or a horizontal point of view of the island, showing, again, current sea levels and projections for 2050 and 2100, and what infrastructure will be underwater. So this is typically airports. In the US, the examples that easily come to mind include the Boston Logan Airport in Boston, John F. Kennedy in New York, I guess LaGuardia actually too, SFO, Oakland probably too, in the San Francisco Bay Area region, LAX and LA, to name just a few examples. Highways, definitely the Coastal Pacific Highway 1 in Hawaii. Pretty much all of the islands are ringed by highways, so those are pretty much all going to be underwater. Power plants, both nuclear, which rely on water to cool them, and other kinds of power plants, and then water treatment facilities, which is, of course, takes away everything we don't want to be near that gets flushed down the toilet, and is also the source of our fresh drinking water. I'm aware that sea level rise doesn't impact uniformly, and I should say too, when flying into Stockholm and then having flown in previously to Gothenburg, it seems to me, and I'm again curious to learn more about Sweden too, that the airports, these two at least, that the airports in Sweden are set back a bit more from the water than the other ones that I've listed. And I'd be curious to hear if the other things that I just mentioned are as well, and then if so, if that was by design to deal with sea level rise, again, knowing that the effects here are going to be different than the other areas that I mentioned, if that was by design to plan for sea level rise and its effects. So let me turn now to reasons for sea level rise, might be familiar to some of you in case they're not, and then sea level rise's impacts specifically on islands. Sea levels rise mainly as a result of three factors, and each one of these is created by global warming, climate change. First, increased ocean temperatures lead to thermal expansion. So when water heats up, it takes up more space, it expands, takes up more space. Second, melting glaciers, as you undoubtedly know here, given the proximity to Greenland. Sorry, that's coming up third. Second, melting glaciers and ice caps are responsible for higher sea levels. And then third and last, the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland have melted at rapid rates, and they contribute to sea level rise. Next slide, please. And there's a couple coming up here. In February of 2018, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences released a new report stating that this melting, specifically, is accelerating, could lead to twice as much sea level rise as previously thought, and that it's up from 1 meter by the century's end to over 2 meters by the century's end. Of course, these figures vary. Different figures get cited by different scientists, and then they always get updated to generally more extreme levels. Last month, in a new study published in Nature Geoscience, next slide please, researchers found that ice sheets in Antarctica are melting away at its base, which has not been detected because it's below the sea surface and could soon overtake Greenland to become the biggest source of sea level rise. I have to say, when this study was released, I was somewhat surprised. Scientists didn't take into account and didn't have the machines to detect melting at the base. I mean, just to me, that's where it's resting in the water. Like, it seems to me, the proverbial image of the iceberg where the majority of it is underwater, it seems to me that one would want to track that and have the instruments to track it. So I was a little surprised by that. Tools for checking predictions for different locations in terms of sea level rise are easily available online. You may or may not be familiar with them. In case you're not, I'll just mention them. And again, I think more for the US context, but I'm not sure. Next slide, please. Through climate central surging seas sites. And then next slide, please. The United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's sea level rise viewer. Have people used these before? Either surging sea? Okay, so surging seas was the other one. Climate Central Surging Seas, and then this one is NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer. So basically for most of these, you can type in a city and then it gives you a ruler, and you can put in a year or you can put in an amount of rise. That's how they typically work. Next slide, please, after you're done photographing this one. So let me turn now to the maps that I've actually created and share a map that I made together with cartographer Emily Bush, and through it illustrate the effects of sea level rise on islands. This is a map that was just published in one of the books that Jesper mentioned at the outset. This is published in Water and Atlas. It's a book produced by the Oakland, California-based Guerrilla Cartography Collective. A number of people involved with it come out of the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley, which is really well known for its critical geography. Trevor Paglen comes out of that program too, amongst many others. Their previous book focused on food, and it was published in 2013, and both of these books can be downloaded for free as PDFs under the Creative Commons at guerrillacartography.org, so the web address that's on the slide behind me. Let me get these maps out. I'm going to pass 2 around, and I don't have enough copies for everyone, but if you could just take one and then, not the other ones, so that people sitting next to you have different have different maps, and you can share in that way, if that makes sense. Like take every other one. The other map that I'm sharing is one. All good? Yes. Cool. The other map is of Hawaii, and this is one that I produced together with a graduate student, with Michael Johnson, who's a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara in geography. And this was for me really, I'm not trained as a cartographer, I'm trained in critical theory, German studies, and film. And so I really wanted to figure out, as much as I've trained myself in environmental science, I knew this was going to be really difficult, and with all the computer technologies that one needs in this day and age to generate good maps, that working collaboratively with a specialist would be the best way to go. I also thought it would exemplify environmental humanities work at its best in terms of working collaboratively. And from the humanities, in terms of environmental humanities, bridging and working with the social sciences. And they were a lot of work. I'm happy to talk about the process a little bit more. Neither of them look anything like what I have in mind for my book, which I aesthetically would like to have much more like Shalansky's book. They were merely for the process of learning how to do this collaboration. So there's the one of Hawaii, and then there's the one of the Marshall Islands. And then if I could have the next slide, that would be great. So the map behind me shows the Republic of Marshall Islands, and hopefully you have that somewhere with someone so you can share it. The Republic of the Marshall Islands, it's located, as you can see in the image to the top, on the top left, the little box there. It's located about halfway between Hawaii, which you can barely make out there in the middle of the Pacific, and Australia to the west. The Marshall Islands consists of 5 single islands, 2 archipelagic island chains that are made up of 29 atolls. And then each of these chains consists of many small islets, about 1,000 in all. Together, the Marshall Islands, in terms of its actual square footage of the islands, totals 181 square kilometers, and it's spread out over 1.9 million square kilometers. I had to fact check that, and I keep checking it because I'm like, are those two numbers, 181 square kilometers over 1.9 square kilometers? I mean, that's just incredible, million square kilometers of ocean. So a little side note about this expanse of water, the region of Micronesia, of which the Marshall Islands forms a part. Brian Russell Roberts and Michelle Ann Stevens recently pointed out in their introduction to archipelagic American studies, decontinentalizing the study of American culture, while, quote, every grade schooler in the United States is taught to view President Thomas Jefferson's 1803 Louisiana Purchase as a landmark event in U.S. history, one that, as the narrative goes, doubled the size of the United States, end quote, it pales in comparison to the, quote, seldom discussed Cold War instigation of a U.S. and one could think about the Pacific not being, being remote and therefore not visible, less populated, therefore not important. It pales in comparison to the, quote, seldom discussed Cold War instigation of the U.S. trusteeship in Micronesia, which more than doubled the size of the United States again in terms of total land and water area, thereby constituting a massive geographical grounding for it as the dominant Pacific power, end quote. Another thing that comes up here is the fact that not only continents mattering more than islands, but land matters more than ocean to some. Yeah, we can talk about that more. I understand well the importance of the nautical and of naval history too. But about half of the nation's 55, so of Marshall Islands, 55,000 residents live on Majuro Atoll, which is the one that you see behind me, which is also where the capital is located. Unemployment stands at a whopping 36%. And as a result, an estimated 20,000 Marshallese have emigrated to the U.S. in search of work. They have the right to live and work in the U.S. as a result of the Compact of Free Association, COFA, C-O-F-A. This agreement establishes a relationship between the U.S. and 3 Pacific Island nations, the Republic of Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. COFA allows, among other things, the U.S. military to station and operate its armed forces in these compact areas, and in turn, the island's residents have the right to numerous federally funded services, in as much as the U.S. has them, and also, among other things, the right to reside in and seek employment in the U.S. And you can imagine how that discourse goes when people, from, say, for example, the Marshall Islands Bikini Atoll was used for nuclear testing, so people then emigrate to the U.S., avail themselves of U.S. services for health care. And then there's a very negative discourse in Hawaii, where a lot of people from the Marshall Islands live, about this use of funding that's totally legitimately being afforded to them. But it burdens the healthcare system of Hawaii. And this kind of a situation is only going to increase, right, with sea level rise. And of course, in thinking about presenting this work here and knowing very well Sweden's incredible, I'll take that back. I'll let you fill that in. That Sweden's position vis-a-vis refugees and the number of refugees that have migrated here from different places. I can only imagine, even if one wants to say, well, sea level rise isn't going to impact us here as much. Indirectly, of course, it will due to this kind of migration, right? So this is one reason why I think, this issue in that way then manifests globally, whether or not it's manifesting locally in terms of sea level rise. Rising sea levels have numerous effects on low-lying islands. As ever, there's commonalities, there's patterns, and there's also differences in these impacts across different geographies and geologies. And that's one of the main projects of this book, is to tally up enough of the commonalities or shared issues that readers get a sense of it by the book's end, but to track the differences enough to pay respect to each island and its differences and to not become redundant and repetitive. First, even what seems like a very small increase measured in a few meters can devastate coastal habitats, making them uninhabitable. On average, the Marshall Islands sit less than 1.8 meters above sea level. They range from a few dozen meters to 1.6 kilometers wide. Additionally, the combination of higher sea levels and increased storm seasons, both in unpredictability and its intensity, leads to storm surges, and then this surging seawater floods housing. This increasingly vulnerable habitat often leads residents to relocate. So on the map behind me, you can see parts of the atoll that are in white, and those are the parts that have already been flooded. You also see some of the images here of what the spaces look like when they're flooded. So this is what we're talking about, king tides. Is that a concept that is used here in Sweden? It's when it's the full moon and the tides are higher. So already in a lot of, in many parts of the world, in San Francisco, for example, where rising sea levels are really impacting already, people are being encouraged to go out and take photographs of what they see during these so-called king tides, because they're indicators of future shorelines. And that's a great example of civic engagement, of citizen science, of getting students, it's something you can do with students. It involves the digital humanities, it's crowdsourced. There's all sorts of things going on with this kind of project where you can actually get students out of the classroom into their neighborhoods and areas and have them documenting the kinds of things that are going on. So what you see here in these images then is the kind of thing that happens at flooding, which happens regularly with king tides during the full moon. Rising sea levels, of course, challenge not only human but also animal habitats, and by which I, of course, in this context don't mean only mammals, but also a loss for fish, as well as birds and plants. And I'm thinking here again on ground as well as in the waters, right? Rising sea levels flood agricultural lands and they upset the balance of soil salinity, that is the salt content in the soil. Salinization, or increased salt content in the soil, is a concern because excess salt hinders crops' ability to take up water. So if you have too much salt in the soil, it can't hold water anymore, and that becomes a problem for agriculture. Global warming also leads to droughts and depleted wells. Thus, low-lying island nations typically face water scarcity. So they're therefore challenged by a double whammy of having at once too much water, salt water, and not enough water, fresh water. The salinization of aquifers, so drinking wells, result in limited drinking water as well as of agricultural soils, and these factors together make life on islands increasingly unsustainable. So what you see on this map is you see Laura on the west in this yellowed region, yellow or ochre, and that area is the freshwater lens aquifer that provides 60% of this atoll's drinking water. You also see two dots there that mark the two freshwater drinking supply wells. And then you see how that, in that photo, you see how that well looks during flooding. And of course that means that the potable freshwater has now been salinated, right? And that, of course, impacts the humans, the agriculture, the animals, etc. Again, the maps that I plan to include in my book are going to look very different from this one, but I wanted to give a sense by showing this to you of some of the impacts of sea level rise and also how to map them. Let me zoom out from the Marshall Islands and islands. Next slide, please. Sea level rise is not only going to affect island nations. Almost half of the US population, so 40% to be more specific, lives in coastal states and cities. In other words or numbers, it's estimated that 13 million US residents will be impacted. In particular, and in order of impact, in the states of Florida, there was just a report this week released about the end of the Everglades. The states of Florida, Louisiana, California, New York, and New Jersey, all states along the eastern seaboard will be affected. After the impacts of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans in 2005 and of Hurricane Sandy on New York in 2012, and then, of course, the hurricanes of last fall, Harvey, which struck Houston, Irma, which struck the islands of Dominica and then Florida, and Maria, which hit Dominica and left Puerto Rico in a total blackout that was projected to last for up to 6 months. And they keep, I don't know if you see this in the news, they keep ending up in blackouts even when power's restored. They relapse, have all underscored the devastating impacts the increased hurricanes can have. And they're increased in number and intensity related to climate change for 3 reasons. First, sea levels are higher. Second, the oceans are warmer, and when the water temperature is higher, it makes a storm more intense. And then third, not only is the ocean warmer, the air is warmer, and warmer air holds more moisture than cooler air. So it leads to more intense rainfalls, these kinds of things that we've been seeing. With regard to hurricanes or tropical storms and sea level rise, Pacific Island nations are the canaries in the coal mine. That is, what happens to them is also a harbinger or a forecaster, a predictor of the future that awaits the residents of coastal cities and shorelines. Internationally, the cities projected to be affected most include but are not limited to Guangzhou and Shanghai, China, Hong Kong, Mumbai, India, Amsterdam, Netherlands, Lagos, Nigeria, Manila, Philippines, Dakar, Senegal, and Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And then the next slide, please. Last November, The Guardian UK published 2 articles based on their findings that call attention to sea level rise. One was entitled From Miami to Shanghai, 3 degrees of warming will leave world cities below sea level. And then the next slide. The other one was entitled The 3-Degree World Cities Drowned by Global Warming. The difference between continental cities and island residents on continents can retreat from these cities inland. Yes, hardship, but for many islands, sea level rise may spell the end of their nation's very existence. That means the geographic place, the history, the languages, the cultures, etc., attached to it. Although a plethora of books devoted to climate change and to effects on island nations exist, most studies that I have found are scientific. By providing a book-length study of the effects of climate change on islands and solutions to them through cartography and geography, environmental studies and environmental humanities, literary studies and creative nonfiction, Atlas of Remote Islands and Sea Level Rise intends to contribute both a new experimental geography and a new environmental humanities approach to climate change that grapples with some of its most pivotal debates about rising sea levels and drowning islands, about climate refugees, which, yes, I think should be a term, and I'm happy to discuss that more in Q&A, about climate change's effects and the solutions to them. Lastly, let me hand out 3 to 4 text samples from the book, and then I will be closing. These are based on my first forays into research for the book. Again, same disclaimer as previously. Stylistically, they have much more of a tone of environmental journalism still. So they're my research into the environmental issues. They don't have the fluidity that I want in terms of the creative fiction, nonfiction. And they don't really have enough of I want to really read some of the literature and more of the culture of these different islands and have that infuse and inform these different essays. And that's also missing from here. So there's one. And again, same with the other one, just 2 on that side. Just so you get a sense of what I view this project to look like. Here's a couple more. Here's a few more on this side. And then here's the text for the Marshall Islands, which is somewhat similar to the other one. So there's just a couple, just to give you a sense of some of these, some of the work that I'm doing. So currently what I'm doing is I'm carrying out the research about the impacts on each island. I'm conducting interviews via Skype right now, not visiting yet, with representatives from local government and nonprofit organizations who can delineate better the specific climate change effects that their community are currently experiencing and how they're working to address them. I'm also interviewing local residents to hear how climate change and rising sea levels are affecting them in a range of ways. So this could be including but not limited to agriculture, business, healthcare, transportation, their daily lives and their routines and how they're changing them in response. I also plan to conduct site visits to some of the islands to see firsthand the impacts, be they the eroding shorelines, the damaged protective reefs, or contaminated freshwater wells that contain excessive salinization from sea level flooding, rendering the water, as mentioned, undrinkable, useless for crop irrigation. I also plan to carry out research related to islands that have been selected because they are so the islands that I plan to include have been selected because they're the most impacted by climate change and because they span a wide geographic range. So they're going to be spanning, including Antarctica, the Arctic, the Atlantic, the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and then this isn't an ocean, but I had to include it for obvious reasons, the Caribbean Sea. By drawing on and combining environmental studies, environmental humanities, cartography, and mapping, as well as the literary studies and creative nonfiction, what I intend for this volume to do is to be of interest to academics, of course, but also to a general audience, to people working in think tanks, non-governmental organizations, as well as policy advisors in government. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion. And the next slide, please.